Ladies and gentlemen, let's Red Gaming Tentacom video. We're going to be discussing a recent interview with Nvidia, in which they were giving their thoughts on PC as well as console gaming and the future of gaming as a whole, actually. So Nvidia may not be directly involved with console gaming, but they are a powerhouse in gaming as a whole, including technology. And they've made their thoughts reasonably clear before with PCs and consoles, but let's just hear from them in this recent interview. So, they had this interview with PC Power Play, but rather than just reading out the interview verbatim, I'm also going to be doing some analysis, as you would expect. So, the interview is with Tony Tamasai, and he's Nvidia's Senior Vice President of Content and Technology. So, obviously, he's fairly knowledgeable man. Anyway, the interview began with the fact that when a new console is launched, the graphics are usually on par, if not better, with a well-spec'd PC. And yet, people have started to notice that at E3, for example, the graphics of the X1 and the PS4 demos aren't as good as the PC demos of the same titles. And then he was asked clearly, do you think the lead on consoles had in the past at launch is over? Now, before anyone jumps on this, think about it carefully. It's actually very true. Titles have actually been somewhat diminished on the PS4/Xbox One compared to the PC counterparts. If you don't believe me, take a look at interviews with, say, the developers of either Battlefield 4 or Call of Duty. Both developers have stated quite categorically, actually, that they have indeed reduced the graphic quality for the consoles as opposed to the PC. And then, of course, you've got the fiasco, and I put that in large quotation marks, around Unreal 4. Now, the Unreal Engine 4 is being developed, of course, by Epic, and you can reverse engineer this, of course, by googling around, but suffice to say that originally there was a lighting technique known as SVOGI that was available, and it was basically an advanced lighting technique, but then they removed it. And supposedly the reason they removed it is because not only can next generation consoles not handle it, that includes the PlayStation 4, but high-end PCs also really struggle as well. To give you an idea, their demo on the UT4 actually required a GTX 680. And most PC owners don't have that level of power. That's Epic's reasoning. However, there was a slew of people who stated that's not exactly the reason and blamed the console. Regardless, Nvidia answered this by saying it's no longer possible for a console to be better or more capable graphics platform than a PC, and I'll tell you why. In the past, certainly the first PlayStation and PlayStation 2 in the era weren't as good really graphically as the PC. Around the time of the PS2, when 3D was really started to come to the PC, but before that time, 3D was the domain of Silicon Graphics and other 3D workstations. Sony, Sega, or Nintendo could invest in bringing 3D graphics to a consumer platform. In fact, the PS2 was faster than a PC. By the time Xbox 360 and PS3, the consoles were on par with a PC, and if you look inside those boxes, they're both powered by graphics technology by AMD or Nvidia, because by that time, all the graphics innovations were being done by PC graphics companies. Nvidia spends $1.5 billion per year on R&D in graphics every year, and in the course of a console's life cycle will spend over $10 billion into graphics research. Sony and Microsoft simply can't afford to spend that kind of money. They just don't have the investment capability to match the PC guys, and we can do it thanks to the economy of scale, as we sell hundreds of millions of chips year after year. There's a second factor in this. The second factor is that everything is limited by power these days. If you want to go faster, you need more efficient design or a bigger power supply. The law of physics dictate that the amount of performance you're going to get from a graphics is a function of the efficiency of the architecture and how much power budget you're willing to give it. The most efficient architectures are from Nvidia and AMD. And you're not going to get anything that is significantly more power efficient on a console, as it's using the same core technology. Yet, the consoles have a power budget of only 200 to 300 watts. So they're going to put them in the living room using small fans of cooling, yet run quietly. and cool. And that's always going to be less capable than a PC, where we spend $250 just on a GPU. There's no way a 200-watt Xbox is going to beat a 1,000-watt PC. Now let me give my thoughts on this, because it's kind of a loaded question. He has some points here. However, most people are not going to have a 1,000-watt power supply for a PC. Regardless, a 500, 600, 700-watt supply is not uncommon. He also has another good point. The fact of the matter is, if you were to even look at the mobile versions of these GPUs, for example, the 7970M, you can easily find out it's significantly less powerful than the desktop variant. So in other words, if you were to take the 7970M, put it against the 7970 desktop, the 7970 desktop, well, stomps it. Now, there are numerous reasons behind all of this: power budget, price, and goodness knows what else as well. So we're going to go into that more in a moment. Because he also comments on the fact that, but now, how is the different from the launch of the PS3 and X360 when they still had the power limitations on par with the PC? He answered, because at the time, PC graphics industry wasn't operating at the limits of the device's physics and power. If you wind back the clock, a high-end graphics card at the time was maybe 75 to 100 watts, and you weren't building chips on the most advanced semiconductor processors. There were billions of transistors. Now we're building the GPUs at the limits of what's possible for the fabrication techniques. Nobody can build anything bigger or more powerful than what there is at the PCs at the moment. It's just not possible. But that wasn't the case in the last generation of consoles. Taken to the theoretical limits, the best any console could ever do would be to ship a console that's equal to the best PC at the time, but then a year later it's going to be slower, and it still wouldn't be possible due to the power limits. But there's a shift here. The R&D budgets required to build a PC-level graphics are enormous. There are only a few companies that can do it. The technologies we're applying to the PC graphics is literally state-of-the-art, at the limits of semiconductor technology. That's why I don't think it's possible to have a console that can outperform a PC. On that note, says the interviewer, we've heard developers say that you can extract roughly 3 times the level of performance out of console hardware as compared to a similarly spec PC, due to the fixed nature of the hardware. They know exactly what they're developing for, and less driver OS bloat. Is this true? Or have newer versions of DX helped tap into the PC performance? Will the next gen of consoles still punch well above their weight? Nvidia replied, I think a console can punch above their weight on some degree, but not by a factor of 3. I wouldn't even say by a factor of 2, partially because they have leaner and mean operating systems and APIs that are closer to the metal, and also because developers can handcraft code for the fixed platforms. Things have changed though. DX has gotten much better compared to where it used to be. The barrier between a DX level interface and the metal interfaces have gotten much closer. It used to be huge, but not so much anymore. I also think the PCs and consoles look alike these days. The PS4 and Xbox One have x86 CPU, a PC-style GPU. It's a giant integrated graphics PC. That's great, because if devs are spending all their time optimizing for PS4, Xbox One, then a good portion will benefit PC, because they're basically doing a PC architecture optimization. It's good for everyone. Developers don't have all these crazy architectures. They have to sort through 80% of the work is now applicable to all platforms. It's great for the gamers. It's great to be as games can be better on all platforms. It's great for the PC, as there's this weird divergences between the consoles and PC, which means a lot of leverage for devs to raise the bar. If we're technological reasons the games aren't being ported to the PC at the past, there are a lot less of those reasons now. End quote. So what are my thoughts here? How much of this is smoke and mirrors on Nvidia's part? Well, some of it, of course. It's sort of true, though. If you actually take a look back at the days of the PlayStation 1, for example, it's very hard to think back that far, maybe for some people, but if you think about it, Tomb Raider on the PS1 and other titles didn't look as good as the PC titles, right? But PS2, it's arguable. I think PS2 era maybe did look a little bit better at the start, maybe the first year or so, than PC. And we're talking about reasonable price systems here. We're not talking, the very best type of systems you could get. Xbox 360, I don't necessarily agree with him on this. I think I'd actually kind of half agree, actually. I would say that they were about even. I mean, I did play Skyrim, for example. Skyrim. I did play Oblivion, and I played it primarily on the Xbox 360 to begin with. Then I upgraded my PC. PC version did look a little bit better, but that was mostly because of higher resolution and slightly better terrain distancing and so on. But ultimately, they were roughly even with one another. I wouldn't really say that one looked better than the other. However, now we're starting to see situations where it's definitely a massive divergence in performance, and this is just something that if you look at the raw performance of, the graphics cards, 1.84, for example, the PS4 compared to, 2, 3, 40 flops of computing power from a high-end GPU or, mid to high-end GPU or a PC. However, of course, consoles do have some major advantages. One of them is going to be the APU architecture inside the PlayStation 4, as well as the compute functions inside the PS4. Now, of course, PCs can do the same thing, but it's much easier to tap into this with the PS4. I suspect, and this is not borne out yet, but I think that the measly CPUs in both systems, in Xbox One and PS4, are going to be heavily augmented with the GPU. Now, from what we're hearing, and this is from Microsoft's recent interview, and you can check it out, I was just doing it yesterday, but Xbox One architects were speaking about this, and they said that they got actually more frames per second on their system, I hasten to add, that does not necessarily indicate the PS4, when they increased the clock speed of the CPU versus the GPU. Now, we're not really certain on how true that is, of course, and we're not really certain on all of the architecture, we're not certain of the overheads, but their increase is about 115 megahertz. Now, from what we understand, 2 cores of the AMD Jaguar are basically being linked to the operating system, which leaves 6 for games. If I had to guess, I would imagine a lot of this is because it's not been heavily multi-threaded or optimized yet. For example, the developers behind Resogun, he says, trying to remember the bloody title, have said that they're using about 50% of the PS4's CPU. Bear in mind, that's only an indie title. But also bear in mind, it's still very early. They are saying that they're hammering the GPU to do a lot of the compute, which would be the particle effects, the physics involved, and so on. So, I can imagine from the CPU side of things, there's certainly some truth to this. As for the GPU side of things, it's still very early. People are going to start citing, of course, that the unified memory architecture of consoles, and I would grant you that obviously it does make some differences, but the thing is, for most gamers, they have enough memory on their GPUs to really put most of the textures on the PC's graphics cards anyway. So PCIe bandwidth doesn't make much of a difference. From what my research is, and certainly it's not conclusive because I still have more to do, but I was actually doing a little bit of research the other day for a completely different reason, and I do remember reading that PCIe 2, and by the way, PCIe 3 is out, but PCIe 2 bandwidth is not being saturated even with very high resolutions and basically multi-card setups. So we're talking like triple monitor setups, which would be like, I can't bother to do the maths, but 5760, I think he says, by 1080, which would be, 3 1080p monitors basically, and they would be running like, dual Crossfire or dual SLI, so Crossfire of course for AMD, SLI for Nvidia setups, and we're talking high frame rates, but they basically did an analysis to look at the data on the PCIe bus, PCIe 2 versus PCIe 3 buses. In other words, how much of the bus was being saturated by sending money to and from the graphics card, and this is including using Batman Arkham City, I believe was the game we were using. It might have been Asylum, but I believe it was City. For those of you who are not familiar with it, that actually has physics in it. And physics, of course, is the physics simulation on NVIDIA. That means that basically you have a lot of particles, smoke effects, and debris and whatever else flying about. Although they did use it on other titles as well, which means the GPU is doing a lot of the work. And with and without that, they found that the difference in PCIe 2 versus PCIe 3 over a variety of different resolutions was actually very minimal. One can logically, therefore, come to the conclusion that bandwidth at the moment on the PCIe bus is not being saturated to the point where frame rate is an issue. So that's just something to think about, So I don't really have a major problem with the unified memory architecture not being on a PC. In other words, we have enough memory bandwidth from the PCIe. It doesn't allow them to do the compute in such a way. However, from what we understand, AMD are planning their own Humor-style devices, or at least APU SoC-style devices for the PC, and they've already started a couple. You can actually consider the Jaguars, the Kabini chips, for example, the low-end prototypes, and I use low-end with quotes because they're going to make much more powerful ones eventually for the PC. Their idea is to basically have an APU with a GPU, a CPU, which can do a lot of the compute functionalities, but for those of us who want to play games, you could then go out and buy a Radeon GPU, and that would work in kind of like a crossfire combination. It does make things very interesting from NVIDIA's perspective, though. NVIDIA, of course, have been said to have sour grapes when it comes to the console industry. NVIDIA have said that they just didn't believe that there was enough revenue in PCs. In consoles. I'm not really sure what the story is. Obviously, they probably tried to tenure their business with Sony and Microsoft. However, one of the possible reasons that it didn't go through, and from what we understand, the reason it probably didn't go through, is because AMD had the APU architectures, which of course are x86-64, and obviously they really wanted x86. Tegra, of course, is from NVIDIA, but it doesn't perform that well as maybe what they had hoped. So it's a little bit tricky right now for NVIDIA in that respect. I don't necessarily agree with all of the stuff this guy said, but I do understand where he's coming from. I think the fact that PC graphics are going to be above consoles is a really surprise. Now, some people, of course, are going to start citing, well, the price difference and so on. The bottom line is, to me, there was going to be a price difference. I am really interested to see what Valve do. Now, one of the primary reasons that PCs cost more is an operating system, right? Because you have to pay for that sucker, which is, £50 to £100, depending on the version, and the time you purchase it, and how lucky you are, whether you've got coupons, whatever. I don't know what it is in dollars. I'm not, going to search. I'm sure you guys know the prices on your own relevant countries anyway. And obviously that's more. I think it's about $100. I'm not exactly sure, but you can, let me know. Regardless, I digress. Valve are stating that they're going to be working on a Linux OS, which is going to be completely open source. I think for the purposes of gaming, it's going to be pretty awesome. Apparently, they're working with gamers, with not only large manufacturers, but smaller ones as well. They're going to be putting this operating system out for free. You can download it, you can install it on a ready PC or their own Steam boxes. I imagine from that point of view, it's going to be really good. I think from the perspective of myself, as a PC gamer, I definitely think we're in for a lot of treats this next generation. I think the PC gaming is definitely going to start improving. That isn't to say that I'm not going to love console gaming, but I honestly think that PC gaming is going to heavily benefit from the new architectures because it's going to be so much easier to implement. I think that new drivers and technologies are going to be better. Obviously, consoles, you can still code closer to the ground level, right? So you've still got much better support, but the DX is getting a hell of a lot better compared to what it used to be. And then, of course, you've got the ability to, say, code in something different, like, say, OpenGL. It's still very early. I think there are some sour grapes regarding Nvidia. Obviously, they are somewhat protecting their own assets. I'm not exactly qualified. I'm not going to look through Nvidia's financials, to be honest, to find out if they're actually telling the truth in terms of the R&D budget. But it wouldn't surprise me. You know, this stuff is becoming very expensive now. What he said about in terms of operating closer and closer and closer and closer and closer to the limits of what's possible technologically, he's actually not lying. He's actually telling the truth. He's talking about the size of the manufacturing processes, and this is what we're talking about the other day in terms of Moore's law, in terms of the fact that, you know, we're effectively getting to the point now where it's a lot harder to basically increase performance, heat, power, consumptions, and so on. This is another reason why GPUs are becoming wider. In other words, we're adding a lot more processors to them, as opposed to simply just increasing the clock speed, which has other benefits as well. It means it can be used for general purpose computing. Nvidia, back in the days of the GeForce 8800s, this is several generations back, I don't exactly remember the date, but, you know, mid/late 2000s, and actually I'll Google that was 2006 November, so quite a while ago, and that's when we started to actually see this SIMD type of architecture, and it was a huge thing from the perspective of Nvidia, because this actually meant that you can actually do stuff like physics, although it was really early at the time. And all this was, of course, because they pretty much bought out Gears, I believe it was, who were creating physics cards at the time. They were actually dedicated physics units that you would install. They were fairly cheap, like, I don't know what the American price is, but they were about £50 to £60. I was kind of tempted to get one at the time, but I decided against it last minute, and then lo and behold, Nvidia kind of just, you know, acquired them, and it was kind of over for them. But that was the first card that used this unified shader architecture, and that was about 2006, and yeah, it's kind of gone on from there. We're starting to see much better technology in the PC graphics space. I think that from the perspective of developers, it's going to be a lot easier to target PCs. And I also think that console gaming is going to benefit as well from this. I think it's going to be much more optimized. AMD themselves have stated that it's no longer really a porting process, it's more you get the code basically and then you just tweak what's necessary. So anyway, this is not really a console versus PC debate. I personally think such debates are pointless, as I personally think both have their own merits. It's kind of weird as well, because now we're seeing situations, of course, where both are kind of muscling in on one another's territory and the lines are becoming increasingly blurred. Regardless, a bit of food for thought. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I will see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.